ahead and get started. Um, I'm Connie Seihrad. I'm the project manager for the Include program, which is a National Science Foundation funded project aimed at empowering neurodivergent students to leverage their unique strengths for innovation in engineering. And of course, we'd like to thank NSF for the ongoing support of our growing neurodiversity initiatives here at UConn. And I also want to let you know that this talk is being recorded and that closed captioning is available through WebEx. You can enable that feature using the closed captioning button on the bottom of the screen. And you can also adjust your layout at the top of the app if you'd like to change how you're seeing the participants and or the speaker. Okay, so with that, I'm very happy to welcome you to our virtual talk with Jonathan Mooney. He's the author of Normal Sucks, Learning Outside the Lines, and The Short Bus, A Journey Beyond Normal. And in addition to a speaker and a writer, Jonathan's a strong agent for social change through his many projects that, among other things, promote mentoring and advocacy for students with learning and attention differences, and also empower youth by cultivating creativity and entrepreneurship. So we're very excited to welcome Jonathan to today's talk as he shares his personal journey growing up as both a dyslexic and ADHDer and navigating an educational system that just didn't seem to have learners like him in mind. So his message that we should stop trying to fix people and start empowering them to succeed resonates with our mission here at the Include program. And so we're super excited to welcome him. And with that, I'm going to pass the mic over to you, Jonathan, and let you talk. So thank you.
Well, right on. Thanks, Connie. Hey, everybody. My name's Jonathan, and hey, I'm really honored to be a part of this conversation today and the mission of the Include project. Now, before I kind of do my thing, I have just a few pieces of housekeeping, if you'll bear with me. First of all, I want to do a visual identifier, which is a emerging best practice in the inclusion and disability rights space to be welcoming and inclusive of folks who may be joining with visual impairments or visual differences. So I'm just going to describe myself briefly. I got Harry Potter glasses on. I'm in my mid 40s. I actually turned 45 last week. I got a short beard, which my 14-year-old likes to remind me daily is getting grayer by the minute. So that's me. I encourage you to think about adopting comparable practices to be inclusive of folks with atypical brains and bodies wherever possible. Second piece of housekeeping. Want to give a big old shout out to Connie and her team. I'm grateful for the opportunity to be a part of their important work. And I ask you, in whatever way you can, to celebrate their important work. Send them some clapping hand emojis, send them some exploding fireworks, whatever it may be, but they're working hard and boldly to build a more inclusive world for neurodivergent individuals and frankly for all of us, and that deserves to be celebrated and recognized. I also want to give a big old shout out at a higher level to UConn. I've had the honor of speaking with and partnering with multiple different facets of your fine university. Just 2 weeks ago, I held a teacher conversation with a group of teachers in training through UConn who were engaging with my second book, The Short Bus. Years back, I was honored to come and participate in your celebration of your formerly known as Disability Support Service institution, now focused on accessibility, and celebrating the leadership that you all have played in the field of inclusion and higher education for many decades. So I want to celebrate that work with you all today as well. Okay, last and not least, I know it's a lot of housekeeping. I want to give you a sense of how I'd like to spend our time together. We got about an hour. You know, I read recently that the average human attention span, is about 15 minutes. 15 minutes. Then I read that the average attention span of somebody on a video conference on a Friday at lunchtime is about 15 seconds, right? So I want to assure y'all that I'm going to respect that research, do my best to keep my talking at you down to a manageable minimum, and then make sure that we have ample time to talk together in the form of questions, conversation, and dialogue. So I want to encourage you, why I'm sharing some catalytic remarks to spark that dialogue, to put any thoughts or questions you have in the chat feature of this WebEx video conference. And we'll use those to facilitate a conversation at the end of my prepared presentation. And we'll also, when we get to that time, encourage you to unmute yourself and ask any questions or share any reflections directly, both with me and with your colleagues who are on this call today. So I hope that sounds like an okay way to spend a Friday lunchtime. And with that said, let me get right to it. I'm here with y'all to talk about how we can empower, oppose to fix neurodivergent individuals. How we can do that if we're neurodivergent ourselves, shift that deficit model to a strength model. How we can do it if we're practitioners, meaning if we're educators or we're student support providers, work directly with neurodivergent individuals. But perhaps more importantly, how we can do that together to build a society, to build institutions, places of work, places of learning that are inclusive of neurodiversity and celebrate it as a valuable form of human diversity, opposed to see it as a form of human pathology. So that's what today's all about. And I'll be honest with you, as Connie mentioned, this is a very personal conversation. It's a personal conversation for me because of my own neurodiversities. And to be honest with y'all, it's a personal conversation because of the struggles I had as a result of being made to feel deficient because of my differences. I was the proverbial square peg that did not fit the round hole of American normality, right? In particular, I did not fit the definition of the normal learner in school. I was the kid who had such a hard time sitting still that I ended up spending a lot of the day chilling out with the janitor in the hallway. I was the kid who, surprise, surprise, had a hard time keeping his mouth shut. So as a result, I grew up on a first name basis with Shirley, the receptionist, in the principal's office. And I was also the kid who had a really hard time with reading. And specifically, I had a torturous time reading out loud. So I spent a lot of the day hiding in the bathroom to escape reading out loud with tears streaming down my face. I didn't learn to read till I was 12. Couldn't read until I was 12. Growing up, I had every label you could imagine, right? I was called the bad kid. I was called the lazy kid. I was called the at-risk kid. And then eventually I became the special ed kid. I was diagnosed with a continuum of language-based learning differences, dyslexia, dysgraphia, and others when I was about 9. I was diagnosed with a whole bunch of attention, behavior, and executive functioning problems, ADHD and others, when I was in 5th grade. And I dropped out of school for about a year in 6th grade. That year when I left school, I struggled with a number of mental health challenges. I struggled with anxiety. I struggled with depression, and I had a plan for suicide because I was getting the message that my differences were deficiencies inside of me. I was immersed, surrounded by a pathology medical model that saw different brains through the lens of deficient brains. I was immersed in a system that too many of us are immersed in that had a narrow definition of the normal learner. And if you didn't fit that definition of a normal learner, you were excluded and marginalized. And as a result of that personal experience, I've been on a mission 22 years now to try to challenge that deficit model and replace it with a diversity model that sees folks with atypical brains and bodies as manifestation of human difference that's valuable to the world. And not only have I been advocating, agitating with many others for that paradigm shift from deficient to different, but I've also been advocating and agitating with others a practice shift that moves away from trying to diagnose and fix folks with differences towards a empowerment model, which recognizes neurodiversity as valuable to the world. So what I want to share with you today is not only the sort of justification and rationale for that shift, which I am so excited to see is accelerating exponentially, but I also want to share with you that practice model, that shift from remediate and fix to empower. And I want to share with you what that means to me, what that means in my own life and what it meant to make that shift. But more importantly, what does it mean for us to make that shift collectively in our own engagement with neurodiverse individuals and in our own systemic design of our systems? So when I think about that empowerment model, there are three sort of core values that get operationalized to make it real in the world. I want to share these three with you briefly, and then we'll open it up and we'll talk together. So let me start with the most important philosophical, ethical principle of empowerment for folks with atypical brains. Empowerment requires us to reframe who or what we call the problem. For most of human history, normal has been called good and right. And experiences, groups of people, behaviors that deviate from the middle of the statistical bell curve, the normal distribution curve, are conceptualized as wrong and deficient. And that's broadly true. Whole swaths of human beings have been marginalized and dehumanized by being called not normal. But that's even more specifically true for folks with neurodivergent brains. And it's operationalized in our language historically and in a whole set of power knowledge structures, to quote Michel Foucault, that conceptualize things that deviate from the middle of the bell curve as deficiencies inside of people. So as a result of that, folks who differ are called a problem, and the problem is put inside of them. I know that personally, right, in my own life. I remember when I was first diagnosed, right, and just hang out with that language of diagnosis. Like diagnosis is intrinsically a medical term. We diagnose pathologies, right? And I remember that diagnosis day like it was yesterday, y'all. I remember me and my mom being called into the school psychologist's office to get the testing result back. And I remember when me and my mom walked into that office, it was obvious that everybody in that room thought we were getting terrible, tragic news. You know, the lights were turned down low. There was soft jazz music playing in the background. I kid you not, there was a box of tissues on the table because everybody in that room was so immersed in the different is deficient view that they thought we were there to mourn the death of my normality. And I remember the school shrink started reading off of the test in front of me. And it was deficit this, disorder that, executive functioning problem this. And I left that room, walked out with my mom, and I said, "Hey, Ma, what's wrong with me?" You know, we put the problem in the person. We conceptualize different as deficient. But I got to be real with y'all. Those folks got the diagnosis wrong. the the problem wasn't my neurodiversities. The problem was the way those neurodiversities were being treated in an environment designed for the idea that we all live and learn the same way. You know, ADD, not my problem, you know. The desk is my problem, right? Let me immerse you into the school desk for a minute, right? This is my experience at the school desk. First grade, 12th grade, college, doesn't matter, right? 5 seconds in the class, the foot starts bouncing. 10 seconds in the class, both feet start bouncing. 15 seconds in the class, oh, I'm gonna bust out the drums, right? 15 minutes in the class, it's all over. I'm the kid trying to take his leg and put it behind his neck. And I was, as too many people are, deeply shamed for that behavior. I was told that I was the bad kid because of that. I'll never forget, I had a teacher named Mrs. C in second grade. I've had many, many gifted teachers in my life, y'all, that I'm going to celebrate with you today. Mrs. C was not one of those, right? She would stop class. She would point at me. All the kids would look at me and she would say at the top of her lungs, "Jonathan, what is your problem?" We put the problem in the person. But the reality is, ADD wasn't my problem. The passive learning environment was my problem. The myth that the good kid is the compliant kid was my problem. And ultimately, the shame and stigma was the problem. Problem not in the person, but in the environment built for the myth that we should be the same. And the same is true with my dyslexia, y'all. You know, I was told that I had a learning disorder and the problem was in me. But dyslexia, dysgraphia, or differences are differences in the truest sense of the word. Now, look, I'm not naive about the neurobiologically based challenges that come with my neurodiversity and many neurodiversities. Look, I struggle with reading to this day. You know, I read. My phonetic awareness is in the 12th percentile today. You know, I get that. I confuse words that look alike. You know, who and how, horse and house. Those words look the same to me. I swear to y'all, when I went to college, I thought my college, Brown University, offered a course in orgasmic chemistry. Okay. Imagine for a moment my disappointment on the first day of that class, right? So I get it, Those are very real challenges. They're not my problem, however. My problem wasn't learning differently, but being made to feel stupid because I learned differently. My problem was the privileging of some brains over other brains, a narrow definition of intelligence that conflates or confuses academic skills with global intelligence, that privileges a narrow band of skills over all of the other manifestations of human flourishing. That was my problem, not learning differently. So that diagnosis, as I said, was wrong. The whole deficit problem in the person model is wrong. The problem isn't neurodiversities, but the myth that we all should live and learn and think the same way. That is institutionalized in our professional practices, like the discipline of psychology and psychiatry, and it's institutionalized in our systems of education and beyond. That's really the problem. And it is the first step, most important step towards an empowerment model, reframing the problem, because when we think differently about folks who live and learn differently, we can embark on a journey of helping those folks think differently about themselves. If you would ask me when I was 12, 16, 18, even into my early 20s, if you would have asked me to describe myself to you, I would have said, I'm stupid, crazy, and lazy. I'm deficient in some way. And I'll tell y'all, I wish I was alone in having that self concept, that debased identity, but I'm not. I've spoken in all 50 states, most states 5 or 6 times. And every time I talk to young folks with neurodiversities, they use some version of stupid, crazy, lazy, defective with me because they've been immersed in that cultural discourse that different is deficient. So when we challenge that, we can challenge that negative self concept. And all the research is clear. When a young person develops a positive neurodiversity identity, they're on a path towards thriving and flourishing in life. I co founded something called Eye to Eye, which is a mentoring and advocacy organization as an undergraduate at Brown that took university students with neurodiversities and matched them with children to give them hope for their future, to give them the message that they're not alone, but more importantly, that they're not deficient as human beings. So, one of my challenges to you all is not only to make the paradigm shift, different isn't deficient, problem's not in the person, but to have intentional activities to build a positive neurodiversity identity and community. And the good news is we don't got to reinvent the wheel. We know now more than ever a series of best practices that are being implemented to build a positive identity for other folks and communities that have historically been dehumanized and marginalized. Black and brown folks, LGBTQ plus folks. We know there's a body of knowledge about how to build those identities, which requires us to embed it in curriculum, requires us to embed it in student support structures. That is the first step towards empowerment. But it's not the only step that I wanted to share with you. Remember, I told you there are 3 things? Second thing flows naturally from that shift of who or what we call the problem. Because when we think differently about folks who learn differently, live differently, not only can we help them think differently about themselves, we can act differently towards, with, and for them. And that acting differently is the second thing I want to share. And in my life, the acting differently was first and foremost represented by my mom. You know, hey, I wouldn't be here if it wasn't my mom. So I want to give y'all a quick mental image of her, if you'll bear with me, right? My mom, um, not a tall woman, you know, on a good day, in high heels, on her tippy toes. My mom is like 4'11", you know, little Irish bulldog, right? And my mom, she's got this really funny voice. My mom has a high pitched, squeaky voice. She totally sounds like Minnie Mouse. My mom totally sounds like Minnie Mouse. And in addition to that, my mom uh, curses like a truck driver. So I want to ask y'all a question. Um, if you were a principal or a teacher or anybody doing wrong by me, did you want cursing Minnie Mouse in your face? The answer, by the way, to that question, if you're at all confused, is no. But that's where my mom was every single day when things were going wrong for me. How did we know she was in the principal's office? Well, we knew she was in the office because every dog in the neighborhood was running away, right? Only bats could hear her high pitched obscenities. My mom understood something intuitively. You know, my mom never went to college, so she didn't read this in a book. She didn't subscribe to some psychological method. My mom knew in her soul that I didn't need somebody in my life to fix me. What I needed was somebody in my life to fight for me, to advocate for my right to learn differently. And that's a huge paradigm shift, y'all. Because when we put the problem in the person, when we medicalize difference, it leads us down the road of fixing or remediating. And my mom rejected that. You know, my mom would say to anyone who would listen, she would say, if my son doesn't learn the way he's taught, well, guess what? Teach the way he learns. Now, I'll admit, that's a little bit of a paraphrase because when my mom said it, there were a whole bunch of F bombs in there, right? That I've edited out for polite company. But nonetheless, that's what my mom was all about. Change the environment and not the person. And that was back then and still is today a bold and radical idea because we've built our systems not to embrace, not to include, not to celebrate atypical brains and bodies, but to remediate and, in some extreme forms, eradicate atypical brains and bodies. We have remediation systems in school. We have a industrial remediation complex in the private sector where there's always something to buy to fix your problem or your kid's problem. It's a make the square peg fit the round hole model. And it doesn't work because when we make the peg fit the hole too much, too hard, too often, eventually it breaks. So my mom rejected that, taught me to reject it. And my mom was joined by, I'll be real about this, a number of on the ground educators who rejected that model as well. And what they replaced it with was not a fix the person, remediate the problem in the person, but a change the environment through accommodations. That's what mattered the most for me. That idea of accommodation comes from the Americans with Disabilities Act, the ADA, which is one of the seminal uh, pieces of federal public policy, a civil rights agenda. Accommodations at its core compels the environment to change and not the person. We got to build literal or metaphoric ramps that create access for people not as we think they should be, but for the reality of who they are. Accommodate and not remediate. Now, in my life, there were all tiers of accommodations from books on tape. That's what it was back in my day. The thing was so big, you had to put it into a backpack and plug it into a generator, right? Then you had Stephen Hawking in your ear all day long, right? But it mattered. To speech to text, which allowed me to get my ideas out, to time extensions on exams, to portfolio-based assessment. And that's just the beginning. When you ask yourself a new question, not how do I fix, but how do I accommodate, you open yourself up to a whole new course of action. That's about changing the environment and not the person. And that's where true inclusion occurs. Now, I'll be honest with you, we got to go beyond the accommodation model because the word accommodate has some negative connotations to it, doesn't it? I mean, think about it for a minute. It's kind of like that word tolerance, right? Which we've all come to recognize we reject, because we tolerate something we don't like that much or we don't think that's good. Let me put it this way about the word accommodation, and its negative connotations that are attached to it. When my mother-in-law comes to visit me, I don't celebrate her visit. I accommodate the visit, right? So we got to go beyond accommodating and holding our nose, to celebrating and embracing. And accommodation not only has negative connotations to it as an ethical principle, but the public policy around accommodations reinforces the pathologizing of human difference, because the only way that you can get accommodations in our current system is to claim that your differences are deficiencies. And then in many cities, spend $10,000 to get yourself diagnosed as deficient. So that accommodation model, while it was progress, has to be replaced with an ethic of not accommodations for some, but accommodations for all through universal design of instruction, of learning environments, of built environments, of places where we live and places where we work and places where we learn. A design principle anchored not in the myth of human sameness, but the reality of human difference. That's the ultimate path to changing the environment, opposed to pathologizing and changing the person. Okay, I got one more for y'all, and then we'll open it up. We'll talk together, right? Told you there are three things that constitute that empowerment model. Redefine the problem, not the person, but often the way the person is treated. Two, don't fix the person, change the environment. Accommodations is a good first step, but it's ultimately got to be universal design, recognizing the reality of human embodiment and the centrality of human difference. And last but not least, an empowerment model requires us to reject the deficit orientation that relentlessly focuses on what's wrong with neurodivergent and neurodiverse individuals. If you're a kid like me, you hear a lot about what's wrong with you all the time. Jonathan can't sit still, Jonathan can't spell, Jonathan can't. What you don't hear much about is what is right with you. And that deficit orientation inherently reinforces different as deficient as an identity. And it's embedded in our systems, our language. Let me give you one of the best examples of deficit orientation that's embedded in our systems. And that's the IEP. I'm sure some of you know what that is. Some of you may not. For those that don't, it's called an individualized education plan, IEP. Got to be real about that thing. NSA, KGB got nothing on the IEP, right? They've been doing deep intel on me my whole life, flying unmanned drone missions over my house, and it ain't good news in that file. The research is clear, whether it be the diagnostic tests, whether it be the IEP, whether it be the 504 plan, response to intervention plan, whatever y'all want to call it, for every one capacity, strength, asset mentioned in the document, there's upwards of 25 weaknesses or deficits. It's a deficit model. And nobody thrives in life hearing all about what's wrong with them. Nobody does. So we got to flip that script. We got to challenge that deficit model. I know the power of that in my own life. I'm all about celebrating folks who were deeply committed to inclusion for the neurodiverse. And one of those people in my life was a teacher, third grade teacher named Mr. R. And this man had a ferocious belief that everybody had something right with him. Everybody, every kid, every human. He also believed deeply that folks who struggled in traditional school have some strengths, gifts, and talents that other people might not have. He saw specific value in the neurodivergent, and he would seek it out. And he would ask kids like me all the time, hey, what are you good at? What are you good at? What are you good at? I know there's something in there that you're really good at or you really love. But the problem was when he asked me those questions at first, I would say, hey, I'm not good at anything because I was over in IEP land, right? And then one day he came to me and he said, hey, Jonathan, I've been watching you. And I got to be honest, you're wrong about yourself. You are so good at telling stories. Now, sometimes they're inappropriate stories you tell, but I don't care. You are so good at telling stories that you could be a writer. I was 9 when that dude said that to me. Nobody had ever said anything like that before in my entire life. I looked at Mr. R and I said, Mr. R, really? You really think I could be a writer? Are you out of your goddamn mind? I can't spell, man. And the guy looked at me and he said, hey, Jonathan, in my class, screw spelling. Screw spelling, man. Yeah, you should have seen me jump out of my body. Because for the first time in my life, somebody said, forget what you can't do for a minute and focus on what you can do. And that was a revelation in my sense of self, that I had something good in me, because I didn't believe that. And it was a revolution in my education because somebody was in my corner who saw my capacity. And so that's my challenge for all of us. Find the good. And it's there. More than ever, we know that neurodivergent, neurodiverse human beings have strengths and talents, not despite their differences, but because of their differences. We know a whole constellation of valuable human capacities: problem solving, creativity, entrepreneurship, social, emotional, and spiritual intelligence go hand in hand with neurodiversity. not despite, which implies that we can remediate the neurodiversity and be all good, but because, which leads us down a paradigm of seeing neurodiversity as essential to humanity, as essential as ecological diversity, as essential to all other forms of human diversity, not as pathology, not different as deficient, but important and valuable to the world. So that's our work. You know, we're getting good at talking about how different isn't deficient, but our work now is to act on it, to do the hard work of challenging those entrenched systems and structures that, despite the words we use, are still trying to make the square pegs fit the round hole, to reframe the problem, to change the environment through universal design, to see the inherent value of neurodiversity to the world. And ultimately, our work is to challenge this idea of normal, because that word's got to go. It's been used to disqualify and discredit entire swaths of human beings. And its time is up. Because the reality is, the only normal people are people you don't know very well. Because the moment you get to know another human being, you know, it's their differences that constitute their humanity. And it's time that we design a world not for the myth of human sameness, but the reality of human difference. And it's time that we together, collectively as a community, fight for every single human being's right to be different. Okay, so that's all I got for y'all. Thank you for listening to me talk at you. Now we're going to switch gears uh, to the more fun part, which is us talking together. So, as I said, drop something in the chat, and Connie and her team will curate from that and pose some thoughts or share some questions, or even better, unmute yourself, say hello to me, and share what's on your mind with the group here. So, with that said, the floor, so to speak, is yours.
Thank you, Jonathan, so much. We have a question from Marissa, our beloved project principal investigator. So she says that you mention a lot having advocacy from the part of your parents, where most students don't have that. So she's wondering if you could share your thoughts for people who feel unsupported by their family, or even people I'm adding who feel like they have to hide their differences from their family.
Yeah. Well, thank you, Marissa, for that, and Carissa for the extension, because both issues, not having somebody in your corner and feeling like you need to hide, are real barriers to thriving with neurodiversity. So let me take each in their own turn. Let me reflect on not having somebody in one's corner. There seems to be two issues there. One is just the presence of somebody. Many students, you know, are in household environments that historically and even more so presently are chaotic and resource constrained, where folks got to work 3 or 4 jobs to get through the day. And I get it. My household was defined by persistent economic chaos. My father was, an alcoholic, drug user, had substance use disorders, didn't pay his taxes. So every now and then the car would be repossessed. So I understand that. And it's important for us to start to think about root causes for parental quote unquote disengagement. And much of that is economic. And so what can we do about that? Well, if we're in a place of macro level public policy, we got to stop blaming parents and start looking at the social conditions around them, right? That's what we got to do. But if we're in the day to day, meaning an educator, student support professional trying to support young people, we can be the advocate in their corner. You know, that shift from, I'm a teacher who disseminates facts, or I'm a therapist who disseminates mental health strategies, to I'm also an advocate that's helping somebody navigate systems not designed for them, helping them understand their rights, because a lot of students don't realize they have a right to accommodation with neurodiversity. That role, that lens of advocate, is something we all can put on, and we all should. Second thing I want to say about that, before I get to the hiding issue, we should be teaching self-advocacy and efficacy skills in school, across the board. Like, we know that um, uh, cultivating a sense of agency and efficacy in young people is intrinsically linked to their academic career, and personal thriving down the road. But that's not a skill that we're cultivating. And I think a part of that is the legacy of, sort of command and control models in education. Expert student. I'm going to tell you what the deal is, and you're going to do it. We're trying to extricate ourselves from that model, but it still runs deep, and it's hard work. So cultivating self-advocacy, just like any other skill, you can learn it. There's models to teach it and practice it that can be embedded in every setting you imagine, from K-12 to higher education to cultivating self-advocacy in employment settings, which are also, by the way, covered in the ADA and are required to accommodate, not remediate. So let's think about how we can advance that. Now, to the question of hiding, which has a bridge to the question of not having somebody in one's corner. I write a lot in Normal Sucks about my own experience with faking or passing as normal, which is a real, and I use that language of passing intentionally, with all recognition and awareness of its historical origins in the LGBTQ plus community, in the Black and Brown community, Asian Pacific Islander community, across the board. I think we need to be extending that concept also to the neurodiverse, because I don't got to tell y'all that I didn't learn to read until I was 12. I don't got to tell y'all that I spell at a third grade level. I don't got to tell y'all that I got 50 different things going on in my head right now, and it feels like I got to jump out of the seat. I can just fake it, right? And I can fake normal. And I spent a lot of time trying to do that. And there's a lot of inflection points in one's life and in the culture that require one to efface who they are and fake normal. And then parental pressure at home is one of those. I know I've faced that with my father, and I've heard that story on many occasions. So what's our way out of this? Well, part of our way out of this, and a part of the at times a part of the parental disengagement, not being an advocate, is that parents have internalized the message that different is deficient. And so they're been acculturated to say, well, it's your problem. You're not going to be an advocate for yourself. I'm not going to be an advocate for you because you got to just fit. I know my dad took that mentality, and no fault of his own, because that was the message being beamed in. So when we start to think about, avenues for change, this shift from deficient to different matters a lot. It has downstream effects around parents, around advocacy, efficacy, and the identity work. And again, I want to be clear, I'm using that word with all intentionality and specificity around the identity work that's being done in curriculums all around the country, you know? But we haven't had a comparable conversation around neurodiversity. Where's our discussion of neurodiverse representations in literature? Let's have that, you know? Where's our discussion of neurodiversity and disability representations in cinema and film? You know, there are still able-bodied actors playing people with disabilities in a way that we would never tolerate with brown face, which happened in the original West Side Story, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, right? So we need to extend some of these bold, transformative practices to neurodiversity and folks with atypical bodies as well, because it gets at that shame, and it alleviates, and it starts to change the social conditions which put an imperative for folks to hide, whether that be in their house or beyond, because it's when we stop hiding that we can start thriving. And that's true in my life. You know, I faked it for a long time. Um, and when I got to Brown University as a transfer student, I met somebody who was not faking it. His name is David Cole. I like to celebrate folks who played a big role in my life. And he was out and proud. And that empowered me to see this as something to be proud about in my life. And so those are the sort of mechanisms of transformation. And that's the sort of type of work that facilitates not just advocacy, which is important, but ultimately facilitates self-acceptance and pride, which is another word we should be talking more about. And when we get to that place of not just acceptance, but pride, now we're thriving in life in a very different way.
Okay, so we have quite a few more questions coming in. So one of the next questions is from Ariana, and they ask, do you have any advice for educators who simply do not receive the proper resources in order to create a suitable and productive environment for all students?
Yeah. Well, hey, we ain't doing right by educators in this country. You know, like the same systems and processes that dehumanize students are doing the same to educators, whether that be macro public policy constraints, which are incentivizing, requiring standardized teaching, down to the very brass tacks of too many kids in a class, not getting paid what you should to do the hard job and essential job you do, to not having the materials. So I get it. So all those macro level problems require political engagement and political advocacy. It requires us using our voting on this issue. It requires us advocating through our professional associations. If you're an educator, through your, if you are a union member, advocating through your union mechanisms, all the ways in which we try to have collective power, and we need to be proactive in that. But I know that doesn't change the day to day, you know? So what I would say to somebody in the day to day is there is a whole number of things that you can do that don't cost money, don't require a learning revolution in our policy, but make a huge difference. Small things that are really big things. What Mr. R said to me, you know, that didn't cost $1, you know? So find the good in your kid and your kids, your students, and celebrate it. And your words matter. You know, nowadays, speech to text, text to speech, those used to be expensive things. They're not anymore. You know, many, not all, but most young people nowadays got that technology in some manifestation in their pocket on their phones, right? So we should be leveraging that existing accommodating intervention. You know, research shows that having a fidget, I've been fidgeting with this thing my whole talk. If I wasn't on camera, I've been chewing on it. And the research shows that just fidgeting with something, you know, it could be a rock. I'm not kidding, a rock, zero money. Fidgeting with something helps a whole continuum of neurodiverse students feel more engaged in learning. That didn't cost a lot of money, right? So let's walk and chew gum. Let's agitate through collective power and mechanisms for systems transformation. But let's do the small things, which really are big things, in the day-to-day. And let's think of it as an and both. And it has to be an and both. because ultimately we got to change those social systems conditions to do right by educators, to build a more inclusive world around universal design. That should be our North Star.
So the next question comes from Abby, who is a reporter from our daily campus. They're also a student who identifies with ADHD. They didn't receive their diagnosis until they were 20, and they say that diagnosis can be restricting and freeing, but it's often the first step to creating accommodations for neurodiverse students that help them to function. So women and people of color often face stigma, barriers in diagnosis. What are your thoughts on the stigma and the barrier it brings about?
Yeah, right on, Abby. But and first of all, I'm not going to do justice to your question because I want to have time for a few more, but I encourage continuing the dialogue. I want to give you a shout out, Abby, for your courage to not fake normal and share something that you know, is very easily not shared, because it creates a space, it creates a context in which others may say, well, hey, Abby did it, I can do it, you know, and that's real change. So thank you for that. You know, let's talk about the diagnosis stuff. So a few things. I like the word assessment opposed to diagnosis better, because as I mentioned, the historic origins of the word diagnose is to identify pathology. It's deeply rooted in the medical model for understanding atypical brains. Now, with that said, assessment can be a damn good thing, right? Because you learn about your brain, you learn about your strengths and weaknesses, and let's be clear, there are neurobiologically based weaknesses that come with certain neurodiversities. I can't spell, I can't sit still, my executive functioning sucks, I have the attention span of a gnat, right? And when we name those as neurobiologically based, it frees us from shame and blame. Because for a long time before the diagnosis, for me, and I imagine maybe for you too, Abby, it was, oh, Jonathan's just not trying hard enough, you know? Jonathan's lazy, you know? Like that was the framework. So it's better to be somebody with divergent attention than it is to be somebody who's lazy, right? And that's a transformation in self. So we shift from diagnosis to assessment, and then the assessment shares strengths and weaknesses. There's nothing wrong with that, right? And then we've freed from stigma, and we've equipped somebody with information about their brain. Now, the economic disparities in accessing assessment runs deep. You know, I live in Los Angeles. That's what I'm speaking from, y'all. Do you know what a assessment from a neuropsych costs in the city of Los Angeles? The going rate's $7,000. $7,000. That's wrong. It really is. So we need to be advancing and celebrating scalable assessments that are powered by technology, because there's no way we can have enough shrinks out there to meet the need. So I'm a part of a social venture called Thrively. It's a strength-based assessment. It's not going to give you an official diagnosis. That's not its point, but it's a way to know your brain. You can find it online, thrively.com, the word thrive, ly.com. And we need to be leveraging the university system, community college structure, to create free or low-cost assessments for individuals. But ultimately, Abby, and here's where I go with it. The reason the reason somebody needs to get assessed beyond personal knowledge, and the reason that it needs to be quote unquote professional assessment, is because we are rationing the right to an individualized education based on diagnosis. Rationing it. That's the accommodation model. Hey, not everybody deserves the right to learn differently. Only people who've got something wrong with them, right? So now we're reinforcing the notion that something's wrong with folks. So the way out of that mess is accommodations for all. Look, speech to text, text to speech. That's cool for me as a dyslexic. It's also cool with the person who has visual impairment. It's also cool for the English as a second language learner. It's also cool for the person who just likes to listen opposed to read. It's universally accessible. So let's move from accommodations for some, which sets in motion this diagnosis industrial complex, and let's move towards accommodations for all. a destigmatizing of neurodiversity and a celebration of the reality that uh, we are all on a continuum of neurodiversity. And sometimes it raises challenges in one's life, sometimes it raises strengths and gifts. And our systems, places of work, where we learn, where we live, have an ethical obligation to see and embrace that difference for everybody, not just for some. So I appreciate it, Abby. Thank you so much for the question. Hey, let me give my email address real quick, because I can hang for another minute if other folks want to, and if there's other questions. But for the people that need to move on in their day, let me give my email address to everybody. So if you have a question, you can hit me up on email. It's my name. It'll come up in the transcript. It's Jonathan Mooney, JonathanMooney. It's Jonathan Mooney, one word, at me.com. Okay, cool. So if you need to go on, thanks for being here. Carissa, if there's another question that you want to pose, go for it.
So this one, someone was just curious about the fabric or painting behind you and if it was related to diversity at all. And we can be sure to send out your email when we send out information to the participants, so
Yeah,
everyone has it.
yeah. So many years ago, many years ago, my first Learning Outside the Lines, which was a book that I co-authored as an undergraduate in college and was published right after I graduated in the fall of 2000, so 22 years ago. I was invited to speak in Australia, um, and um, and many facets of that experience were life changing. But one facet of it was being deeply immersed in um, by others, not I was immersed through their knowledge around the um, real tradition of indigenous definitions of intelligence. Um, Claude Levi-Strauss wrote a book called The Savage Mind. Let's put aside the antiquated word savage for a minute, which is a big put aside, but nonetheless, the ethic of that book is that um, there are cultures historically that know differently than we do. And that difference isn't deficient. In some ways, it could be better. And I think we're seeing a reemergence of that concept as we look at how a sort of European imperialist way of knowing has led us to environmental collapse. Whereas other cultures, indigenous cultures in particular, um, uh, were a way of knowing and living that were inherently more sustainable, and one could argue more just and equitable. And so that's a very obtuse and long-winded way to say, in my deep uh, learning about indigenous culture definitions of intelligence, I was given what is an Aboriginal dot painting, and that's what's behind me, which uh, is a form of knowledge. It's a map. It's a deep map, and a form of knowledge dissemination and historical continuity within that culture. And so it was a deeply felt gift, and beyond being a visually beautiful, I think it's intellectually um, challenging for us to think about how we define intelligence as the kid who can read and write. There's been whole swaths of time in the history of humanity in which that's not the pinnacle of intelligence. There's other pinnacles of intelligence. And I think we're at a moment in human history in which we need to reclaim a broader definition of what it means to be smart, because look where that narrow definition has got us, and it ain't a good place. So I have that up. That's what's behind me. probably
Awesome.
more than what people thought I was going to say about a thing in the back of a webinar. But yeah.
Yeah, so my apologies. To Jessica. I had the view in stack, so I didn't realize. But Jessica, please feel free to unmute yourself and go right ahead.
Yeah,
Yeah.
thank you. No worries. I was just, I agree with so much of what you said here, and I think it's really important. And I'm a future teacher, for context, and I'm also autistic. And I guess my main thing is that I think a lot of what you said about challenging stigma is so important, but I do take, I won't even say take issue. I'm confused about, would like clarification on the fact that you seem to think that a big part of challenging that stigma is moving away from the language like disability and identifying as disabled, and rather focusing on difference. And I think, I mean, you said it yourself that changing language doesn't change the issues. So I guess I don't know that I agree with that approach, and I'd like to hear more on why that's the route that you seem to be taking.
Yeah, right on. And take issue, for sure. This is it's all cool to, you know, that's the uh, that's what I'm always most excited about when folks thoughtfully engage and challenge, whether it be something I said or somebody else said. And so thank you for that. And I think I very much I very much think that I'm not even personally clear about where that stands right now, both with myself and with the um, broader conceptual framework that is emerging. And I think emerging is really the right word. And like any other emerging conceptual framework, there's complexity, there's confusion to it. So thank you for rightfully, astutely identifying that, and for giving me an opportunity to reflect on it. I was going to say clarify, but I don't think clarify is the right word. Reflect is the right word, because I think there's still groping towards clarity, if that makes sense to you. So let me give you a couple thoughts. Um, I very much anchor both my own sense of self, um, and subsequently my own advocacy in a certain reading, but I think a reading that has some wide uptake, uh, uh, within the realm of critical disability theory and disability rights. And I very much affiliate myself with the disability rights movement, and do and hope and strive to be contributing to the disability rights movement. But that raises your question, which is, do I claim disability in my own life or not? So the line of thought for me, and this is really a um, distillation of not my own thinking, but of others in the critical disability theory movement, is that embodied human beings are on a continuum of cognitive and physical difference, right? Part of that continuum is less common, you know, than other human experiences. Not everyone is dyslexic. Not everyone experiences the neurobiology of autism. Not everyone um, experiences deafness, right? So we have a continuum. There's one less typical part of the continuum for any human trait that we identify. And those people, on myself included, on that part of the atypical spread of the distribution curve, experience disability in environments not designed for them. They are disabled, not intrinsically, but by the interaction between their difference and a context not designed for their difference. Now, that may sound like a distinction without a difference, but it really is. Again, where does it put the problem? It doesn't call the atypical part of the bell curve deficient. It doesn't call it less than. It doesn't call it inherently a problem. It says that the problem is in the interaction between difference and environment. And we've built an environment for the middle of the bell curve where the typically occurring traits are, opposed to the whole continuum of human beings. And so that's the social construction model of disability, right? Which is trying to reject a medical model. And in the arc of broad theories of disability, the medical model, first was the moralizing model, which comes directly from the Bible, right? Like, you're evil, literally. And then there was the medical model that came in and said, no. These folks aren't evil, but they're deficient in some ways through a pathology lens. Then there's the social construction model. Now, there's a fourth emerging framework, which doesn't have sort of a nice, cute name, but it's pushing back on the idea that we're all just sort of social constructions, and we can sort of post-structuralism like wave away these differences. It's reemerging to the idea that no, look, check it out. Like look at my brain. Look at the fMRI of my brain. The left hemisphere is smaller. That's the reason for struggling with reading. Look at these real neurobiologically based differences. So there is a sort of reemerging of an essentialism around there. That's trying to not say we're all social constructs, but at the same time not say that we're deficient. And that's where I think the next wave of work is going to go on. And that's where I think there's less clarity, at least in my own thinking, about what that sort of expression means in language and in practice. Now, with that said, I wrestle with, as you rightfully noted, to say that I am a part of the disability rights movement, to say that I experience disability but don't have a disability, is getting a little bit into the rhetorical weeds and may dilute our power as a community, you know? And I don't think I know how to reconcile that yet. I can tell you that I'm inspired by in the same way that the LGBTQ movement embodied, recognized different expressions of human sexuality, didn't negate that within those expressions of human sexuality, there's different political and or conceptual frameworks, but held it together, right, as one movement, you know? And they threw the plus on there, rightfully so, to make it as inclusive as possible. That's what we need in our neurodiversity and disability rights movement. And I think that framework is helpful. Neurodiversity and disability rights. We can affiliate around the disability lens, or we can affiliate with the diversity lens, but nonetheless, we all are advancing for a society that's not built for the middle of the bell curve. That's what we're all about. We're advancing for a society that recognizes the reality of the human continuum and the centrality of not just human difference, but of human valuability. You know, there's a great saying in the disability rights movement that says, and I'm going to amend it with a neurodiversity lens. The saying usually is, we are tabs. We are temporarily abled bodies. That ableness is the fleeting state, not disability, because we all age. We have fallible bodies. I throw in there, we are all temporarily abled bodies and minds, and we're all trying to build a world that doesn't privilege the normal or able human over others, and is built around the reality of human embodiment. That's what we're all working for. Have we figured out all the language yet? Have I figured out all the language yet? Certainly not. Thank you, Jessica, for a very astute and thoughtful question. And for dedicating what it sounds like will at least be a part of your life to going out there and making a difference in the lives of young people. It's always mattered, and it matters more than ever now.
Thank you, and thank you for your response.
Yeah.
And I also want to thank you for that. You have definitely enriched our conversation, both with the question, Jessica, and with that really detailed answer. So thank you so much for that. And thank you to everyone who has joined us today. And if you want to stay on for another minute, that's okay. But if you need to move on, I think we can wrap up. That was beautifully said there at the end there.
Yeah, sounds great. And thank you, Connie. Thank you, your team. Thank you, everyone who took time out of their day. Send me that email, and keep fighting for a world that's more inclusive. That's our work together, and whatever expression it takes, it matters. So thank you all very much.